All right. Would someone be willing to lead us in prayer today?
I will.
Great, Siobhan, go ahead.
This is Dory.
Oh, Dory, I thought Siobhan came on. Dory, great, go for it. Thank you.
Lord, we just give you this day, and we pray that you would be in our time together as we learn from one another and help us in all that we do, that it would bring honor and glory to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, we are on week 4 of the course. There's always so much to do in this course as we're getting through the writing of a proposal, and I know it's a little bit stretching at times. As I tell students, this course mainly gives you practice in working on that proposal. Hopefully, you've been thinking about a topic throughout your education here at BGU, so with that topic, you're putting together a proposal, and we realize that your project may not be totally specific. Well, not the word specific, but it may not be totally developed at this point. Okay, and we want you to be thinking about that. Even as you come up with your proposal, that proposal may change a bit, even as you complete this course, and that's fine. What the goal will be is to have a proposal. Once you come to this course, you'll have a proposal that I have looked at and given my feedback, Dr. Henry has looked at and given her feedback, and then you'll be able to get together with your supervisor and be able to work through that proposal even a little more specifically. A supervisor may have other recommendations that will be helpful as you're putting together a proposal and beginning to launch a particular project. Once that proposal is completed and you and your supervisor are in agreement on that proposal, then it will go to our BGU academic cabinet. And as a cabinet, we'll look at that and may have some additional recommendations. And once it gets through that particular approval process, then you're ready to continue on with the actual final project process. If you don't have a supervisor yet, I do recommend that you be looking through the website, the BGU website, and see if there are faculty members that you have particularly enjoyed working with, and that would probably be a good choice. It's good to have often a BGU faculty member working as a supervisor, because hopefully that person is at least somewhat familiar with our particular dissertation final project process. That doesn't mean that you're restricted. There may be someone that you know that has an earned doctorate that you feel would really make an excellent supervisor for your project, and that is perfectly acceptable. What we will ask is to have a CV, a curriculum vitae from that person, just so that we have a record for our files that person is qualified and has the proper terminal degrees for the kind of work that we ask in terms of a dissertation supervisor. You also need to be thinking about a second reader, and that is a second person that's a part of your dissertation committee. That person will, right now, that person gets specifically involved toward the end. I'm really trying to work on that process so that second reader, and I'd like to start to use the name even an associate supervisor, who can begin to work with students even at the beginning of the process, so you have more than one person giving input. But so be thinking about a supervisor, and then someone who maybe would function in a secondary supervisory role as a second reader. And again, if you just finally hit a brick wall, a dead end, give me an email, and between myself and others of us on the staff, we will probably be able to help you locate a particular supervisor and then a second reader that would be able to work with you through this process. Okay. Any questions on that issue? Okay.
Well, this
We're
is.
going to,
Can I ask a question, Bill?
go ahead, Lynn.
Sorry, I couldn't get my mute button off fast enough there.
I know.
Could you keep going from the description that you just gave and outline what happens after that point then?
Certainly.
Okay.
As once you have a supervisor, you and your supervisor, again, go through the proposal, get it ready for the academic cabinet. It's approved by the academic cabinet. And then, of course, you simply begin working on the process, the research, the gathering data, putting together whatever you're going to be putting together within your context. The idea is, as you work through your process and write various chapters in the dissertation, you would submit a chapter to your supervisor. Each time you complete a chapter, that supervisor would look over that chapter, give you feedback, and then you may make some revisions. You kind of go through that process throughout the dissertation work. Once you've gone through that process, and hopefully you will, as we've been stating in our class here, the research gathering phase should naturally lead into the transformational strategy phase, that you'll test out some kind of a strategy related to your topic. And again, then you'll write up the results of that phase of the dissertation. Once you've gotten through all those phases of the dissertation process, you'll have a first draft that will be approved by your supervisor and approved by your second reader or your associate supervisor. Once those approvals are in place, I, as the BGU Director of Final Projects, will also look at that project. And if there's any issues that I see that I think need to be addressed, then I will give you my feedback. Actually, as we're thinking about a dissertation committee, again, we're kind of in process right now of making this committee a little more formal. There would be at least 3 people a part of that committee, a supervisor, an associate supervisor, secondary reader, and then myself as the BGU representative. If I happen to be the supervisor, then we would bring in another person from the BGU faculty or staff that would become the BGU representative. Anyway, we would continue through that till you have a final draft. Once I've approved it, your other 2 people of the committee have approved, then that draft goes to our BGU technical reader, who will go through your project in a detailed way, making sure it conforms to APA formatting, making sure that you have documented your work well, that there's a good organization to your work. So you'll get feedback then from a technical reader. Once you've made all the changes to your document based on the technical reader's recommendation, you would schedule an oral review. The oral review is about a 2-hour session that you will give maybe a 20-30-minute presentation that summarizes the work you've done, how it's related just to your whole educational process. And so that oral review is basically consists of the 3 people, myself, the supervisor, the second reader, and then any members of your PLC who could join that. We like to have them as a part of that oral review. So that's kind of the culminating event for this process. Once you've made it through the oral review process, then you are established as a candidate for graduation.
So the length of time to actually do the research is very short, seems to me. Is that true?
Well, so let's just say you're in this class right now. Hopefully you will have a proposal. The work for this class is due at March 24th, I think it is. So you would have your proposal completed. You'll have feedback from myself and Dr. Henry. Hopefully you would have all that feedback by the first week or 2 of April. You would gather with your supervisor, make sure that you have everything that's needed there. hopefully you could then submit a proposal to the academic cabinet by, end of April, 1st of May. Once it's approved, then you've got from about May through the summer months into the fall, I think the first draft, a completed draft, is due to your supervisor by about December, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to look at the schedule. So you'd have about 6 months to be working on research and transformational, a transformational strategy, if your goal is to graduate, say, in 2020, June of 2020. If it seems like the process is going to take a little more time, then of course you would extend your graduation. We issue degrees, in June and December. We only do one graduation a year, but some students will, because of various circumstances, will end up having a degree granted in December, and then they would participate in the following the ceremony for the following June. But based on, if you're in this class now, you'd probably have about 6 months, I think, to work on the research and in the strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Just one question on that, attached
Anthony,
to that, Bill.
go ahead.
What are the courses that associate with that process? So there's a dissertation 1 course and a dissertation 2 course. How do we enroll in those? Do you just enroll in the first one when you're ready to get going? Enroll in the second one when you have a draft?
Exactly. Yeah, you would just enroll. You can do that online. There's what DFP 701 and DIS 701, depending on if you're in the DTL or the DMin.
Okay.
So when you do that, we actually have an online Populi course that we use. We just started trying that out over the last year, and so we're still kind of working out some of the kinks and bugs and trying to get students to really utilize that online course. But the idea is to be in a Populi course, and that you would then upload your work, your chapters to that course. Then your supervisor would be able to look at that, and I check into that course too, and I can give you feedback. We're kind of at a point right now, I think, of trying to make that course even a little more structured. Right now, it doesn't have the kind of structure I feel it probably needs. So that's the first section. And then I think we have a second section. I'd have to talk to Dr. Judy and now Dr. Bridget, who's our new registrar, to see what actually is going to be taking place even if we're going to have a second section that will actually have a Populi course connected with it. But yeah, the idea is to be involved in a Populi course as you're writing, developing the dissertation.
Okay. And you enroll in those essentially when you're ready to engage?
Yeah, actually, sometimes I think Judy has actually just enrolled people in those courses, if I'm not mistaken. Once you actually have your, I think the trigger is when the academic cabinet approves your proposal. Then you are entered into the first section of the dissertation writing process.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other of those kinds of housekeeping issues that we should address?
I'd like to add to that.
Go ahead.
So the dissertation part 1 would be similarly how we're walking through each week in this track. It would be us walking through the next stage of the more formalized version, or the more structured version would be us writing sections at a time and submitting it. Is that what you're okay? Right.
And basically, you've chapter 1 of the dissertation basically is chapter 1 of your proposal. Okay, those same components are actually included. So you'll have chapter 1 of your dissertation basically written. We of course expect you, once you've gotten into the research, to be able to possibly fill out in a little more detail some of those sections. Same thing with the literature review chapter. You will have written a literature review chapter for your proposal, But again, when you write the dissertation report, again, you will have done more reading, hopefully, more research, and you'll be able to even, fill out that chapter. It'll become a bit more robust in terms of what you're able to include there. Same thing, research methodology. You write a research methodology, a chapter here for your proposal. Once you get into the writing of the dissertation, you would be able to, fill out that research methodology chapter in more detail and say what you've actually done in terms of a research process.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, Dr. Henry said she's getting much noise on her. And is anybody else getting a lot of noise?
No, that's over.
Okay, okay,
When I came on, it was noisy.
okay. All right, and be watching the chat room because Dr. Martin also put a comment in there in terms of the 32 credits, how that fits into the, as you move into the candidacy stage. All right. Well, today we're going to just look at a few of the final pieces of the introduction chapter. We'll be talking about, basic assumptions, limitations, delimitations, scope, that whole area, and then definitions, some of those issues. But before we get into that, let's just kind of open the discussion for a few minutes here in terms of what you've been doing on your purpose statement, your research questions. Any thoughts, questions, concerns that you'd like to bring up? We can just have a little bit of an open forum on that topic for a few minutes here.
This is Lynn. I'm just going to say the challenge for me is to keep trying to keep it focused.
Right.
The topics can be so big, but then not narrowing it so much that there's not adequate research or, for example, in my topic, which is benefit corps, they've only been in the United States since 2010. So is there enough background? Is there enough, are they in a place for me to actually do the research? So that's my challenge.
Right. Yeah, but 2010, you've got, 9 years of work there that you can hopefully be looking at. I'm not sure how much writing has been done at this point. That'll be the issue in terms of the literature. But I mean, in terms of CSR, there's of course a lot of general information that you'd be able to read on that, and also on the 3 Ps, same kind of issues. So that's the balance that you're looking. Even in your literature review, you're looking at some of the general concepts, and then you're looking at more focused concepts. So you need a little both. The broader context will help your reader, see how your particular project fits into, say, CSR, corporate social responsibility, or the 3 Ps. But then as you focus on the benefit corporations, that's going to narrow your focus, hopefully, a bit. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. Trying to find that balance between the broad and the narrow. That's a challenge, and that's a challenge always in any kind of a dissertation writing process.
Right. So I'm looking at leadership development, though, Bill. So if organizations haven't been around long enough,
Oh, I hear you.
haven't had to face the issue yet of developing more leaders. So,
That's true.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just ask you, this can be helpful just the whole class. At this point, what are you thinking about? How do you want to get at the data, get at the information that would help you begin to explore this area and come up with some kind of a process?
Well, looking at the research, obviously, in one area, but I'm also meeting with people. I just started developing relationships with people in the network who are on the boards and that kind of thing.
Okay.
where are these organizations at? Is this a viable topic at this point in their development? So that's how one of the ways that I'm approaching it is putting more expertise to look at the topic with me.
Yeah, I know. Boy, I think that's really an excellent way to go about it, because, your initial interviewing is even helping you formulate the topic, even maybe a little more specifically. And that's great. I mean, that's exactly what we want to see happening in terms of the research phase. Yeah.
So Dr. Bill,
Go
this
ahead.
is Felicia.
Felicia, hi.
Yeah, I'm so sorry I can't on my video because I don't want to lose any connection with you all.
Right.
Yeah, on the same line with what Lynn just said. So we are able to use personal interviews with leaders in replacement of empirical data. Is that what I'm hearing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, your interviews with leaders, that is empirical data, because you're getting firsthand accounts of how people are perceiving a particular situation, etc. Yeah. But like I was saying to Lynn, some of that initial research can actually help you define the problem and your purpose statements even a little more sharply.
Okay, so how do we get that down onto footnotes or endnotes?
Well,
if we are interviewing people.
In APA, for example, you just put a parenthetical that says personal communication, and then that's all you need to put. Generally, you'd put a personal communication and a date.
Okay, and the name of the person that we have interviewed?
Correct, right.
Okay, all right, that's
and,
great help.
Personal communications do not need to be entered into the reference list. This needs to be a note, within the text with a parenthetical.
Okay.
But yeah, that's valid. That's valid empirical data that can even be used if you're doing that kind of research even at the beginning, even as you're talking about your problem or purpose statements. You'll get into even more detail, of course, analyzing your interview data in the research methodology in the results chapter. But those are perfectly acceptable documentations as you're looking at the problem and the purpose statements also.
Okay, so do I also need then to attach as an appendix the kind of questions that I've been asking? Like, I have a list of questions that I've asked them. So do I also put that in as a appendix?
At the proposal stage, we do ask that you give us some sample questions that you would be using, say, in interviews or surveys, focus groups, etc. You could either include those in an appendix, or you could actually just include those in the research methodology chapter, which would be chapter 3 of the proposal. When you actually then do the dissertation, you would have a copy of the whole, what are interview questions, survey questions, and that's usually appropriate since those will be a little more lengthy to put those in the appendix, and then you refer to those pieces within the text of your dissertation chapters.
Okay.
But
All right,
at
thank
the proposal stage, you would have some samples of those kinds of questions that right now you are anticipating asking. So that'll go into chapter 3 of the proposal that you're working on in this class.
Oh, so in my research paper right now, I don't need to actually, or rather in the homework that I'm doing right now, in the assignments that I'm doing right now, I don't actually need to list that out, correct? It's only when it's in the dissertation?
Like I was saying, right now you're working on chapter 1, okay?
Yeah.
If there was say you had talked to somebody and you felt like what they said is very related to defining your problem statement, then you could quote that person and then put in parenthetical personal communication such and such and a date.
Okay.
In the research chapter, which is chapter 3, okay, of your proposal, you're asked there in the data gathering section to give some samples of the kinds of questions you anticipate asking as you get into the more detailed phase of data gathering in the research process. So that'll be chapter 3. You're not working on that yet. So
Okay.
you would put some samples of the kinds of questions that you anticipate using in your research. Chapter
Okay.
1, again, if you have a communication that you want to use as helping to document what you're doing in the problem, then that's fine, and you just put in parentheses, personal communication, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, may I just add a comment in
Go ahead.
response to Felicia's question? I noticed she questioned how to source the interview, and she mentioned footnotes. But I think I just want to remind the class that we are using APA. So with the APA style, we do not do footnotes. Now I've noticed, and I know that's everybody's challenge and weakness, that not many of you are familiar with APA style. And I'm just saying to you, it is quite tedious and boring, but you need to pay attention to it. You either do it now or you suffer the pain at the end of the process. Take your pick. But we are required to use the APA documentation style. A gentle reminder.
Right, and as you look at your syllabus, the APA style manual is actually one of the required textbooks for this course, and so I do recommend that you get a hold of that text. There is also there's the online organization APA.org, the American Psychological Association, and then there'll be /style or something that gets you into the style menus. You can go to that website and you can enter just about any topic. It's personal communication. You can enter that in the search box, and it will show you actually how to put together the parenthetical reference for a personal communication. And as Dr. Henry said, though, our main focus is APA. We do allow the Turabian still for people who are in the DMIN program, but we really are preferring, and that's the way I write it now, our preferred style is APA, because if you're working in the social sciences and mainly in the business sciences, you're going to need to know APA so that your writing is acceptable and recognized within those disciplines.
And Bill, I'll just add, I think the APA manual is actually in the BGU library as well. So.
That's true. Okay, good. Yeah.
I have just a confession to add to the conversation, and I'm trying to manage a deepening sense of angst, and I think it somewhat relates to maybe what Lynn was alluding to. But I've had this idea about a topic for a long time, but I haven't really read on it deeply, and so now I feel like I'm in a process where I'm asked to become very specific about this and identify a body of literature and develop a proposal, but at the same time be reading the books required for the class, which I did the pre-reading, but I tell you, reading it before and coming back and reviewing it to find the answer that you need are two different efforts. So I'm just, I almost feel like, I need to develop the proposal, but then I need 6 months just to read the body of literature.
Right.
I don't know how I'm going to feel ready to do a literature review before the course is over. So I don't know if anybody else is feeling that, but I sure feel it.
Yeah. No, I really sense the challenge.
Interject something, Bill?
Go ahead, Martine.
Actually, you just don't ignore all the books that you read for your other courses. The courses that you take, and especially the electives, should actually lead you and do a lot of work for you in the dissertation. technically, some of the essays from your elective final assignments should be just copied and pasted and into your dissertation. Some of your book reviews could be copied and pasted into your dissertation. So it's not, we're not having you do busy work for 32 credits and then you start your dissertation. You have started your dissertation now with all the courses that you have been taking so far and that you are going to from now onwards. So don't feel too overwhelmed. We hope that you just take it piece by piece and use all your coursework, all your reading in your courses. Focus on what you are going to do in your dissertation.
I appreciate that very much. I do take to heart, though, the assignment about how to read a scholarly article critically, and it's time consuming. And while I'm struggling to find exactly the body of literature in depth that relates to my subject matter, there are a lot of things I want to read. So. Anyways, it's several plates to keep spinning at the same time.
Yeah, and you can always negotiate the recommended readings section. You have the required readings, you have to read them, but in the recommended readings, if you want to include some books that are pertaining to your subject matter and to your dissertation theme, if you want to include them as recommended readings, you negotiate that with your instructor, and it's completely legitimate. I really want to make sure that you know that you have already started working on your dissertation and do as little busy work as you can. Use as much as you can from all your coursework into and put it into your dissertation.
Yeah, that really is a good point, and I just probably need to emphasize that again. While you're here in the course, we are trying to help you know how to dissect a research article. We had an assignment on taking 2 research articles and looking at them, trying to identify the problem statement, the purpose statement, the research questions, etc. A lot of us weren't trained in that kind of a process in our education. I've been thinking that we probably need to even maybe do more of that even at the beginning of the educational process here at BGU, because I'm just amazed how our educational system has not trained in a general way many people in just some of the basics of how to do research, how to read a research article, how to organize thoughts, and how to document. Some of those things that we should just take for granted at the doctoral level, I fully understand that somehow our educational systems have not trained in those kinds of disciplines. I mean, I even look at my own education. Some of those issues were not emphasized early on in my education. I've had to develop some of those skills even as I've been doing the teaching at BGU for the last 20 years. So it is pretty amazing. And so, yeah, but back to what you said, Anthony, when you're trying to, say, doing the literature review, I would recommend looking back even through the syllabi that you've worked with in classes, look at your projects, your papers, see if there are readings that you did for those classes that nicely fit into the literature review. The other issue I would say is when you're putting together the literature review at the proposal stage, I am not expecting an in-depth understanding of say 20 sources. What I'm expecting is that you will have, if there's sources that you've already looked at because of other classes, you'll probably be able to speak a little more authoritatively on those sources. There may be other sources that you've been able to just kind of scan and you're writing them down and you have a general idea what those articles are about. And if you think those are going to be very germane to your project, you can include those in your literature review. But at the proposal stage, you're not necessarily going to have an in-depth understanding of a lot of the sources that maybe will be relatable to your project, other than the sources that you've already looked at for other classes, as Dr. Martin just mentioned.
That's good. That's helpful. Because a lot of my work has been looking here and there, and I grab an article and think, I need to read that. What's the essence of it? Okay, I think that's what it's about. I'm going to put it here. I'm going to come back to it. And I'm kind of gathering resources like that.
That's good. And just scan them. Yeah.
Okay.
Cresswell has, some of Cresswell's book gets a little convoluted in my mind, but I thought he has some pretty good ideas on how to gather literature. And he's put together a whole system on how to look at literature and how to, track it, how to scan it, summarize it, and then, have it recorded for your later work. But at the proposal stage, I'm going to just keep emphasizing, you're scanning material, you're scanning content, determining, does this look like it's going to be helpful for my project? Okay. Well, this has been a good discussion, and if you have more of these kinds of thoughts, go ahead and email them to me or to Dr. Henry, and we can do our best to keep answering some of these issues. Okay. What I would like us to do is get into a few components of the literature of the introduction chapter, and I've asked Dr. Henry to pull up some PowerPoint slides, at least on what the idea of a basic assumption is. Miriam defines a basic assumption as I was just kind of looking at her book on page 298, I think it is. Yeah, what are your biases? What should we know about you, the researcher, that will help us understand how you're approaching this study? How might you be interpreting the data? What you're going to be sensitive to, and so forth. What's your relationship to the topic under investigation? That's on page 298 of Miriam's book in terms of assumptions. Sensing kind of does the same thing on page 20, at least in my book, and 44. He's talking about assumptions. And I've asked Dr. Henry to give us a little more input on that. That, again, and sometimes, even as I read different authors on some of these traditional components of a dissertation, there's not always an agreement. Even when you get into what we call the theoretical framework, we've talked about that. Even the word theory has different definitions that seem even just totally opposing each other. In one sense, a theory is something that has not yet been proven, okay? But on the other side, a theory is a set of principles that have been proven. So sometimes language can be a bit deceiving and distorting. And even assumptions. Sometimes assumptions, and Dr. Henry, if she would come out to do that from a quantitative perspective, there would be some issues that we would define an assumption from a quantitative assumption perspective. We can maybe talk a little more about that. Dr. Henry, let's go ahead and get into the PowerPoint slides, and we can maybe talk a little more in depth, at least in the time we have left here, about assumptions.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Okay, research assumptions. Assumption is an everyday word. All the time in our everyday conversation, there are assumptions. There are what I would call unstated or unidentified assumptions. However, in the context of research, which requires transparency, it is important that at the beginning of your research report, you identify the basic assumptions underlying your study. the thing about assumptions is even when you don't identify those assumptions, somebody else reading your work can come up with the underlying assumptions. But in research, you're required to identify your underlying assumptions. Moreover, in quantitative research, assumptions are even more important because part of the research process is about testing your assumptions. Tested assumptions are what we call your hypothesis. So that is important as we look at the issue. In fact, as I looked at your own work, your questions, the questions that you listed that you were considering, that you are considering for your research, implicit are those in those questions are certain assumptions. And in some cases, as I've responded to you, I've made mention of your underlying assumption. Okay, this is a PowerPoint presentation that I have found in SlideShare. It's not one that I have put together, so the credit is there on the first page. An assumption is a realistic expectation, which is something that we believe to be true. However, it may be that you do not have adequate evidence to support your assumption. But the thing about research is that you're moving towards the evidence to support the underlying assumption of your study. In other words, this writer says, an assumption is an act of faith which does not have the empirical evidence to support it. The assumption provides a basis to develop theories and research instruments, and therefore influence the development and implementation of the research process. And just by way of example, using your own work, I'll just pull up a few of them. I think Melvin, and he may have left because he said he was having some problems with hearing. The assumption, one of the underlying assumptions that I see coming through from his proposed research is that he thinks that churches should have an influence on gentrification in their neighborhood. That is clearly an assumption that he's bringing to his research. Now, an observer may question that assumption and say, why do you think that churches have the influence or the power to influence gentrification? And that would be a legitimate question. So be aware of your assumptions and be ready to answer the questions that are going to be asked concerning the assumptions of your study. A definition: assumptions are statements that are taken for granted or are considered true, even though they have not been scientifically tested. Assumptions are principles that are accepted as being true based on logic or reason, but without proof or verification. And then this is good that he has done for us, because I've mentioned to you the relationship between the assumption and the hypothesis. The assumption becomes an hypothesis when you move to test the assumption. So the assumptions are basically beliefs and ideas that we hold to be true, whereas the hypothesis is a prediction. Often with little or no evidence, and they are not statistically tested in research. That is your assumption. But when you move to testing your assumption, it becomes a hypothesis that you test statistically, and you may either accept or reject it based on the results of your testing. And assumptions are beliefs about the variables. Actually, they are beliefs about the relationship between the variables. As a hypothesis, the assumption becomes a prediction about the relationship between two or more variables. And just to illustrate again from your own work, the issue of relationship between variables, I think Siobhan wants to look at the impact of fathering on the growth and development of kids. So you have two variables there, the concept of fathering, and then you have the concept, well, two concepts, some people may say, rooted in psychology and biology, growth and development. So she is undoubtedly proposing to test the relationship between the two variables, fathering and development of children, just by way of example. Based on belief, assumptions are based on beliefs. The researchers attempt to discover the correlation. The hypothesis predicts a relationship between the variables, and we test those statistically. Okay, let me just stop to give you an opportunity to ask any question for clarification or to make any comment. And I will put this PowerPoint in the course, in this week's course outline. Any questions, comments?
Let me just make one comment that comes to my mind. And I think, like I said, some of these issues gets down to the authors. I was looking at, Sensing quotes Kleinman, who says, quote, "Examine your emotional reactions to the setting, the study, and the participants. If you don't, your feelings will still affect the research process, but you won't realize it." This area of assumptions seems to include a fairly broad base of content. Some, and like I've even said worldview, when in the template, I said even your worldview is going to affect how you look at a particular situation. So, like you said, in say, especially in quantitative research, a person may decide that an assumption is going to be one of the tested hypotheses within the study. So I think we would have to probably decide which assumptions are going to actually become part of the empirically tested work in the project, and what assumptions are just going to be stated as assumptions. I was thinking of, say, we'll go back to Melvin's work in gentrification. Churches, a question, should churches have a positive influence on gentrification? Okay, now what are the underlying assumptions to that? I mean, we can go right back to the basics. When we had, in the early 50s and the 60s here in the United States, we had what we call the social gospel compared to the more pietistic gospel. We at BGU, we have an assumption that gospel is not only a personal issue, but the gospel should also have an effect, a transformational effect on the environment where we live, a church. So we could go right back to an assumption. Some people may look at a church and say they don't really have a responsibility to be involved in the social realm of their context. Others will say, no, that is part of what it means to be a Christian. We live and we influence our surrounding context. So that is just a basic assumption that many of us have at BGU. But if we want to define that, we could say, yeah, that's an assumption. And I feel like I can go from a theological discipline, I can go and begin to prove that assumption if I need to. But I may not choose to make that a part of my testing or my proving within my dissertation. I am just telling the reader, this is a basic assumption of mine. We are involved in transformational leadership as a school at BGU. And so that is why say for Melvin, why he would think a church should be involved in influencing a positive way gentrification. Just one example of how an assumption may or may not need to be proven or, or involved in the actual testing process within your dissertation.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
This may sound kind of odd, but how do we manage, because we kind of, in the assumption process, when we're doing the research, we see what we're looking for. But on the other end of it, if it's on the opposite side, people are seeing what they're looking for. So there's so much research out there. If I'm, like in my example, if I'm talking about fathering, someone else may have research that is saying that there's not an impact, that kids are developing, whether there is or not. So how do we look at how, in our approach, how do we move forward, or do we look at the well-rounded view of it? Because basically, if I'm showing up with an assumption, I'm showing up looking for what I want to see. But how do am I supposed to make sure that it's fully well-rounded? Because people see what they want to, whether it's gentrification or people feeling like churches should just stay in their place and not be involved. So I'm kind of curious about that.
Go ahead.
I'd like to answer that in terms of the research process. Because it's research, there are certain expectations we have of your approach. Mm-hmm. So you come to it, the assumption is the beginning process. And basically what we're saying is that you need to be aware of the assumptions that you bring to your research. It's the beginning process. And it's important that you be aware of your assumptions, because those assumptions will influence how you do your research. They will influence the research articles that you choose to read or you choose to dismiss. One of the requirements of good research is that you need to be objective. So you need to, when you know what your assumption is, when you realize that your assumption will influence your approach, then you would be more aware and intentional in making sure that you pay equal attention to the research that presents itself. Because one of the things you don't do in research is you are not setting up to do research to prove your point.
Good.
Research is what happens when you are curious and you want to answer questions. So you need to go to the process with an open mind. And one of the ways to help you to get to the process with an open mind is for you to be aware of the assumption that you bring to the study, the assumptions. Aware of them and make them be transparent. Put them out there, state them. In fact, some of these assumptions you may end up testing. You may translate them into hypotheses that would be tested by your study. So that's what we want you to understand. Does that make sense?
It does, it does.
Okay. So the uses of assumption in research. Research is built upon assumptions. Since a foundation is needed to move forward, you have to assume something to discover something. Assumptions listed in research papers may be good sources of the research topic. Your assumption will drive you to the literature, to the other research. The assumption provides the basis to conduct your research study. Tested assumptions are really hypotheses. True research studies expand the professional's body of knowledge. And he lists for us different types of assumptions. I'm just going to pass over that. Universal, and he gives us some examples of what he calls universal assumptions, beliefs that are assumed to be true by a large part of society, but they're not necessarily tested or testable. For example, our belief in God. Okay. Then you have assumptions based on theories, and that's in our camp. Assumptions may also be drawn from theories. For example, going back to Siobhan's proposed research, there are theories about child development. And so that when we think of the impact or the influence of fathering, we have to think of that in terms of what are the theories of development saying about the role of fathers in the development of children. And there is research out there on that. The issue of development is rooted in a number of fields. There is the biological field, there's a psychological, there's a sociological field. So you have to come to the process with that awareness and allow the literature to speak to you and guide you in finding the answer. Because the underlying question here is, what is the impact of fathering on the growth and development of children? Okay? If a research is based on a theory, the assumption of the particular theory may become the assumption of the research study. That's a given. Okay. The assumptions needed to conduct a research, he talks about what he calls common sense assumptions. And because this presentation is rooted in nursing, he gives an example. The prevalence of coronary artery disease is more common among urban people as compared to rural people. There are what he calls warranted assumptions. These are stated along with evidence to support. I'm going to skip over some pieces because I want to get to limitations and delimitations. Okay. Limitations. There are restrictions of the study due to the theoretical or methodological reasons, which may decrease the credibility and generalizability of the research findings. Usually there are two types of limitations in research studies, which may reduce the credibility and generalizability of the findings. There are what are known as theoretical limitations, and then there are methodological limitations. In research, we want to do a research that is meaningful. Meaningful not only to the immediate context in which the research is being done, but meaningful globally. So one of the things we do as we look at research is we want to be able to generalize the findings of our research to other contexts. Now, one of the challenges that we face when we do research oftentimes is that we become so focused on the context that we ignore the greater part of the research. Context is just a small piece. What is more important are the concepts that are being tested. So, and for beginning researchers, there's always that tendency to become so bound to the context that you forget the theoretical underpinnings. And this is where the whole issue of generalizability comes in. Whatever the context of the research, a good piece of research should be able to be applicable in different contexts. Now, it doesn't mean that a context-bound research doesn't have worth. It does. it will have worth. However, one of the markers that you move towards when you are doing research is you want to be able to have other people look at your research and says, yes, this makes sense. I mean, just common language. We can see this applicable to our context, though our context may be different. Okay, theoretical limitations. They restrict the ability of research findings to generalize due to the use of specific theoretical concepts in the study, or limiting the study of variables through operational definitions. Let me just explain that a little more. We've talked earlier about the conceptual background of your study, and that is very important. In the quantitative research, we are testing the theory. In the qualitative research, at the end of the study, we may, as a result of the findings that we have, we may propose a theory that we want to test in further research. But whether it's quantitative or qualitative, the focus of the research is on theory. We always want to remember to keep the focus on the theory that is being tested. In a quantitative study, we talk about the operational definition of the concepts. That is, because you're measuring the concept, let's say again, development. There is an operational development, definitions of development. And by operational, we just mean that we define the term in such a way that it can be measured. That is what is important. And especially so if your study is a quantitative study. The methodological limitations, they usually result from the method of study, the factors such as unrepresentative sample, weak design, single setting, etc., the method of your study. Now, for example, in doing the qualitative research, you may choose, among other things, to do interviews. In terms of methodological limitation there, the question is, are those persons that you interview representative of the sample of the population that is on the study in whatever you're doing? For example, let me see somebody else's study. Okay, Dory is proposing to do a study that looks at the effectiveness of church counseling in improving the well-being of individuals in the church and in the community. When I look at that statement, right away, I ask myself questions about the concepts. How measurable are they? How do we measure effectiveness of services rendered by the church? For example, what does it mean to have an effective counseling center? So we have to go to the research literature to be able to define and measure that, because you have to measure that. If you're talking about effectiveness, then that's a measure, that's an evaluation. And then I have here improving the well-being of the individuals. What do we mean by improving well-being? How do we measure well-being? How do we get to make a statement that as a result of the counseling services of our church, the quality of people's lives have been changed? So you see what I'm getting at here? The method that you use for the study is going to be important. And that method is going to be reflective of the theory underlying the study. What is important is that you have to make sure that your sample that you're going to use to help you to answer your questions that that sample is representative. If it's not representative, you could still do your study, but then you'll have to report. Remember, the basic foundation of research is transparency. You will have to report that the sample that you use is not representative. That doesn't mean that your study doesn't have value. It would mean that it has limited value to that group. But if it is a representative sample, it would have a wider audience. Then there's the issue of the weak design. That takes us to chapter 3 methodology. But there are designs that are strong and there are designs that are weak. Going back to your sampling technique, sometimes people do the kind of studies where they stand at the corner of the street and they interview people who pass by. That is a weak design because you really can't identify the demographics of such a group of people who passes by that street at a particular point of time. So if you do a study where you do interviews on that basis, you have a weak design. Just talking about methodological limitations. Sorry, I want to go back up to that. Researchers usually mention limitations of their study so that the readers can have an idea about the credibility and generalizability of the research findings. Again, just being transparent with your readers. And then he's given us some examples from the field of nursing. Effectiveness of planned teaching on the knowledge of staff nurses working in a psychiatric unit regarding physical restraints for psychiatric patients. And notice he's clear in terms of his context in selected hospital of Vidarbha region. The study is delimited only to the nurses working in the units of the general and specific hospital. The study is limited to the population that speaks English. The study is limited to registered and licensed nurses. The study is limited to nurses with GNM and BSc nursing education. And the study is limited to the experience level of the researcher. This is one example of how you identify the limitation of your study. So you say the study is limited to, you identify the population, you identify the context, you identify the participants in the study, etc., etc. Okay, that brings us to the end. Any questions, comments? As I said, this will be in this week's course outline, so you could review it for yourself.
Just a quick question from me, and that is, where are you saying that all of this information is actually put in the document?
In our week 4, I usually load it up. I'm sorry, and you will see it come up as a PowerPoint presentation or as a presentation.
No, I'm sorry. I mean, where in our paper do we write about assumptions?
Oh, chapter 1.
So where exactly? After the purpose statement? Just anywhere? Where are we talking here?
Let me answer that. You need to be using the template which has each of the sections identified, and these kinds of definitions are included for each section in the template. So yeah, assumptions takes place, somewhere down after the purpose statement, etc. But look at the template; it's all there. It shows you exactly where all those pieces fit.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're about out of time, but I want to just make one comment. As we're looking at limitations, delimitations, etc. And of course, a limitation is a limitation that's imposed upon you because of the circumstance. A delimitation is something that you choose to limit your situation. If we were going back to your study, Dory, for example, if we were going to use that term effectiveness in terms of of the counseling center that you've worked with, you could use a mixed method of research, and you'd get into this in chapter 3. But you may you may decide to put out an anonymous survey to a segment of people who have utilized the services of your particular counseling, church-related counseling center. And your idea in the survey is to kind of get an understanding of what their experience, good or bad, positive or negative, has been in relationship to the counseling center. You could do that as an anonymous survey, and that would be kind of a quantitative study as you're just trying to get an idea. Then you may choose, there may be a small group of people that would be willing to sit down with you in an interview session and actually tell you how the counseling was effective in their life. That would be more of a qualitative approach. And so you may use a mixture of research approaches, but you know, the limitation is you are confining your research are people that have been clients in your particular counseling center. You're not doing a nationwide survey. You're working within a particular context. So that would be the delimitation that you've imposed on your project. If I remember right, Anthony, you were going to focus more on possibly churches within the Southern Baptist Conference. Okay, so you've delimited your particular study to a particular denominational group, and you may say the particular Southern Baptist churches in Arizona, right? So those are all pieces of the delimitation study. Okay, any other quick questions before we need to close the session down? You know, as always, there's a lot to absorb here. And especially as you look at, when we look at a PowerPoint, there's just a lot of content there and a lot of technical content. You have to read through that, and that PowerPoint will be put into the classroom on week 4. You can look at that, and what you need to look at is then try to interpret that content as it relates to your particular project. And you know, I always try to take content and simplify it in my mind as much as possible so that I can then apply it to the particular situation where I'm needing to apply that work. So whether it's assumptions, delimitations, we didn't get into the definitions section today, but it's defined within the document I just uploaded to the document, the files section of week 4. But, you know, there's a little difference in terms of definitions in a quantitative or a qualitative study, and you can maybe read a little bit about that and read it in both. There's stuff in Cresswell, there's material in Miriam's book, and there's some in Sensing's book on definitions that you can kind of read for yourself.
I have one last question, Bill.
Go ahead, Lynn.
If you are choosing a dissertation supervisor, would you lean towards a subject matter expert or a research expert?
You know, if in your particular situation, I would probably lean toward a content expert, just so that you know, within that situation. You know, both Dr. Henry, we're always available for questions on the research side of the situation, you know, but I would think, you know, if you have a content expert that could really help you, I think that'd be helpful most of the time.
Thank you.
I agree with Dr. Payne on that.
All right, I think with that, we do need to close the session down to honor our time. Again, we'll look forward to continuing to interact with you in the classroom, and I'm looking now at week 3 assignments, and Dr. Henry is giving a lot of feedback within the discussions especially. So hopefully we can proceed through with that kind of interaction. We will gather again next week, same time, same place. And next week, we will start to think a little more about the literature review chapters, finishing out the work that you're doing now in chapter 1. Any other questions that you have, you know, bring them up next week, and then we'll start introducing the literature review chapter and start allowing you to start working on that a bit. Okay. let's see, you had one question, Felicia. And I'll just answer that for the class. You know, can you still use the Turabian style as approved by Dr. Judy Milton? I think our handbook says if you're in the DMIN program, you can use Turabian. I think we also have the condition, if you started this program and you've been using Turabian, and so you basically from academia, when you start a program under a particular catalog, you are allowed to continue your process under that catalog, okay? So depending on when you started the program, you would be allowed to use the Turabian format if that's what you felt comfortable with and that's what you've used in your educational experience here at BGU. I think, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, though, if at all possible, I encourage people to at least try to possibly use the APA style just so you become accustomed to that style so that you can use it within the, especially in the social sciences and the business sciences, et cetera, where many of us are trying to make a difference with our Christian values. Anyway.
Dr. Payne, may I add that if you're thinking of publishing your research and you are writing it under the social sciences and you're most likely going to look towards a peer-reviewed journal that is in the social sciences, then it would be to your advantage that you use the APA format. Because if you don't, then after you've done your work, you're going to have to go over and edit the entire document so that it conforms to the APA documentation style. So I'm just throwing that out there.
Okay, good. Well, enough said. I think with that, we're going to close down the session and again be seeing you within the classroom. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.